most of you know, last week I officially finished my doctoral dissertation, which is all about this church, how it got here, and what the future can hold for it. And the title, if it sounds long, it is. The title is With a Little Help from Our Friends, a Church and City Revitalization Partnership in Danbury, Connecticut. If you think the title's long, the dissertation itself ended up being 160 pages. So that's where I've been for the last couple of weeks. You know, on this anniversary Sunday, it's officially been 113 years since this congregation rose like a phoenix from the ashes of its fourth meeting house. You know, some of you who are relatively new to First Church may not even know what it is we're celebrating today or what it means for us. And if you've been watching from home or from a distance and away from Danbury, let me fill you in. As people here who are in the sanctuary can see, our bulletins have a picture of the phoenix on the front. And for those who slept through the classics classes in high school, let me fill you in on what that means. The legendary mythical phoenix is a bird found not only in Greek and Egyptian lore, but in many different cultures. According to the legend, the phoenix is it's really immortal, but it's meant to live 500 years. And at the end of its time, it creates a nest for itself. It lies down in the nest, and it sets the nest on fire. And when that's done, from those ashes, suddenly, the phoenix rises from its own ashes, glorious again, stronger than ever before, and begins to live the life of that golden mythical bird. So, on the morning of May 6th, 1907, it was just another average day here in Danbury, over by where the Danbury Savings Bank is now. Nobody had any idea what hardships might exist by the end of the day. But somehow a fire broke out inside our fourth meeting house. If someone knows how or who might have been responsible, this information has mercifully not been recorded by this church, you know? So perhaps this is an act of Christian forgiveness, so that no one bore the responsibility or stigma for the loss. And then again, the fire maybe just happened. At any rate, the beautiful wooden church with the high spire and the big bell that could be heard all over Danbury was reduced to a pile of ashes. And its bell became a molten pool of metal. Saved from the flames were two items sacred to this congregation, one of which is the Comfort Star baptismal font, which was at a deacon's house across the street. And the second was the Emerson pulpit that sits out there. That was in the middle of the flames. But it meant enough to this congregation that a group of men literally raced into the fully burning church and carried it, and it's 300 or 400 pounds easily, to safety. Now, for some congregations, this tragedy might have overwhelmed their faith in the future. But these were our forebears. They knew a thing or two about tragedy and about resurrecting their faith from the ashes. They also had a vision for the church, and it wasn't a pile of ashes. You see, our founding families had by that time already lived through 210 years together of prosperity and pestilence, togetherness and schism. And still they were together. The challenges that they had, we don't even think of today. Let's put it in an early 20th century perspective. In life expectancy in 1907 was 45 for men and 49 for women, which means most of us here this morning wouldn't be here. Okay? Now, around 1907, children under the age of 5 represented 30% of all deaths in the United States. 30% of all deaths for children under 5. Now, that's far better than the mortality rate back in 1696 when we started, where 1 out of every 2 children would not make it to 5. Think of that. Think of the sorrow. Think of the inability to plan for the future. So you can understand now when you see the Comfort Star baptismal bowl why it was sacred. You know, and you can also understand why one's faith and church were so critically important to a congregation in that day, because church was where you went in the beginning and at the end of your life. Important. So our church leaders knew there was no pausing for grief when the 4th meeting house burned. In 1 week's time, they raised over $25,000. Now, what is that in today's money? $25,000 today, and it was a church of movers and shakers. $25,000 today would be approximately $858,000 in 1 week. Pretty good. And those church leaders then took that melted steeple bell and made it into dinner bells that they sold to the community to raise funds for a church building. It also tells you something about what this congregation meant to the rest of the community, to the city of Danbury. And it was while studying this that I found out things I never knew about our congregation, our meeting house, how it was used, and our community. Now, first of all, with all of our modern concerns about the separation of church and state, it really wasn't happening in those days. In our first and second meeting house, our building was the only one in town for any meetings, public meetings, whether spiritual or governmental. In colonial New England, the state existed, literally it's in the books, it existed solely to wield enough power in the interest of gospel purity. I want to talk about mixing church and state, that's what it is. The typical early meeting house, like ours, the church was in a high pulpit. It wouldn't have been anything as grand as this. And below him in the first few rows were reserved for deacons. The deacons would have been there. And as they put it, it was also reserved for elderly men who couldn't hear well. So guys, you'd be made to sit in the front row all the time here. So, and then the rows behind that were for the town officials. The mayor would have been there, the councilman would have been there. Town meetings often included the church pastor thundering forth with his opinion on the town meeting topic of the days. No separation whatsoever. So while the fact that the First Congregational Church was the center of both spiritual and civic life for centuries, that meant we used to have inspirational speakers here. That's how we ended up with Emerson speaking from our pulpit. Wonderful things like that. But then it also had its darker moments. And when I read these, I felt, because we pretend they don't exist or we've forgotten them, it has to be mentioned. So, since Danbury was the seat of Fairfield County, in the late 18th and early 19th century, when there's a major trial or conviction, it would take place in Danbury, even though the crime took place elsewhere. And the first one, in 1799, a man named Anthony, a black man from Long Island, supposedly committed a rape in Greenwich. And he was brought here. And he was sentenced to death in front of the Danbury judge. So what do you do after that? You bring Anthony to our congregational church, which must have been our second congregational church, where he was seated while our minister, Timothy Langdon, called his state deplorable and demanded that Anthony repent and die in a Christian temper. Anthony was then walked from our church to Gallows Hill, which is a slight rise in the land on the corner of Elm Street and Beaver Street, and hanged. In 1817, a black man, Amos Adams, pleaded not guilty to the rape of a white woman, but was convicted nevertheless. And the records from Connecticut history said that military guards removed Adams from jail and marched him to the Second Congregational Church. Adams sat in a pew with a halter around his neck as Reverend William Andrews gave a sermon to the completely crowded church. After the service, a procession marched Adams up West Street to a scaffold erected at the intersection of now Elm and Beaver Streets. There was an immense crowd, they're talking about thousands, gathered for the execution. Some of the spectators arrived in Danbury early in the morning or came the night before, and then they purchased refreshments from stands set up around the gallows. Some even climbed trees so they get a better look at the hanging. That's from Kendra Baker of Kinetic Humanities. It was the last execution in Danbury, thank God. I went down myself because I couldn't imagine that this wouldn't somehow be memorialized. And I went down to Beaver Street and Elm, and there was a slight rise. I could see no monument, no plaque. But then I looked and I saw one little street with a sign on it called Mourning Lane, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, Lane, Mourning Lane. And that's all apparently we care to remember of such an awful thing. But, you know, despite our terrible racially motivated acts, First Church was one of the leaders in welcoming people of color and other ethnicities into the church. In the 1820s, the women of this church began to offer Bible study to groups of black children, and that grew and grew. And in the 1890s, our church was seen as the leading practitioner of the social gospel. If you don't know what that is Washington Gladden's theology that industry leaders and their workers should sit side by side in church because all were equal. And we were seen as the leaders in this. So, and when the church leaders in 1907 finished this building in 1909, they gave us this. They gave us this. And today we celebrate the thousands of, I always think of the thousands of little feet that I've heard kicking the backs of the pews down here. Thousands of little kids since 1909. And the soldiers we sent off to multiple wars from here. And all those to whom we said our first hellos over at the baptismal bowl and said our last goodbyes. Blessed be the ties that bind, now and for as long as God wishes us to be. Amen.